Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. In today's video, let's discuss the various routing options we have within our digital audio workstations and our mixers. Notably, we will be looking at buses, subgroups, auxiliary tracks, sends and returns, and even have a look at inserts, VCAs, groups, and how they work within digital audio workstations in particular. In this video, we will be working with Logic Pro, my DAW of choice, although many of these routing options will work the same regardless of your digital audio workstation or your mixer, so long as your mixer has these routing capabilities. My goal with this video is to get you familiar with a lot of the different terminology that is used when routing in mixers and DAWs, and hopefully to even show you some routing options that you may not be familiar with yet. So let's hop right into Logic Pro and get the video started. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to have a look at the various routing options we have. This is a session that I'm currently working on mixing. It's not released yet as of the recording of this video. However, once it is released, I will leave a link in the description box down below for you to check it out for yourself. And the reason I chose this session is because I'm using all of the different routing options that I wanted to discuss in this video. So I figured it was a great example to use for this video. So let's bring this mixer up right here and we can quickly have a look at what we have. So here we have our drums going into a dedicated drum bus or drum subgroup. The semantics are a little fuzzy there. I'll get back to that in a second. We have two bass tracks being sent to a bass bus or a bass subgroup. We have two guitars going to the guitar bus. We have a sax solo, two trombones, a trumpet, and a horns mic that was picking up all three horns at once. These are all being sent to the horn bus or horn subgroup. We've got keys and a key subgroup. We've got a lead vocal throw, two background vocals, the vocal bus. We have parallel compression for the drums, a snare plate, stereo delay, mono delay, guitar verb left, guitar verb right, X delay, XX delay. Those are just extra delays that I'm using. This one is not actually being used. We've got a long plate, vocal reverb, big snare reverb, more parallel compression. This is for a funk guitar part that comes in. We have got a sax solo send right here, sax verb, and here is my talkback mic. And here is the stereo out, which is the output of Logic Pro. So to start off, let's discuss buses, which is likely the most common routing tool that we have in our mixers or digital audio workstations. So a bus in audio engineering is a signal path used to combine multiple signals together and to route them to a specific location. And here's where the fuzziness of the semantics comes into play. A lot of mixers, myself included, will call these channels the drum bus or the bass bus or guitar bus. However, a bus itself is not a channel on a mixer or digital audio workstation. It is the signal path that routes certain audio from a channel or multiple channels to another channel or multiple channels. Some confusion comes into play when people like myself label these channels as the drum bus, but really this is the drum subgroup, which we will get to in a second. Bus signal paths are physical in hardware and virtual in digital systems such as Logic Pro and other digital audio workstations. Buses are often used for routing to subgroups, which we just discussed a little bit and I'll get to later. They are also used to bus to auxiliary tracks, which we will also get to later, and of course to the output of the mixer. So let's have a quick look at how we are using busing in this particular session. Starting with the drums, we can see that the audio channels, including the kick in, the kick sample, kick out, snare top, snare sample, snare bottom, hi-hats, tom 1, tom 2, overheads, and room, are all being outputted. You can see here the output is bus 1. So bus 1 is combining the audio from each of these channels and it is routing it to this drum subgroup right here into bus 1. So we can see input is bus 1 right here. It's a stereo input because we are sending stereo information to this subgroup. But at the same time, we can see here that in our sends, we are sending almost everything to bus 11 right here. And then we're sending the snare tracks only to bus 12. And we have them set up to go to bus 21, which is automated later in the session. Now, if we were to take bus 11 and find the input of that, we scroll over, we see that bus 11 is the input of this parallel compression for the drums right here. So the bus is the signal path used to combine multiple signals together. In this case of the drums, we are outputting the drums to bus 1, which comes in on our drum subgroup right here, but we are also sending audio before the output from each of these channels to the parallel compression drum channel right here. Moving back, we can see here, if we take the guitars, for example, we have these guitars, 2 tracks. One is panned to the left, one is panned to the right. And both outputs of these 2 audio channels are being routed to bus 3. Bus 3 is a signal path that is combining these 2 together, and it is sending it to the guitar subgroup right here. We can see that we have a stereo input that is bus 3. So the bus is the signal path. In this case, it's a virtual signal path that is routing the output of these 2 channels into the input of this channel. We also see on these guitars that we are sending guitar 1 to bus 16, and we are sending guitar 2 to bus 15. If we scroll over, we can see that the guitar verb left is 15, and guitar verb right is bus 16 as the inputs. So in this case, we are not using a bus to combine multiple channels together. Rather, we're using one bus to send audio from one channel to one effects return, and we're using another bus to send audio from another channel to another effects return. But again, the bus itself is just the routing signal path that is sending audio before the output, in this case, guitar 1 being sent to bus 16, and guitar 2 audio being sent to bus 15, which is then coming in on the inputs of these 2 effects returns. We will get to effects sends and returns shortly, but I just wanted to drive home the point that busing is the signal path, virtual or physical, that sends audio from one place to another. One last point on busing, we see that a lot of these channels have stereo output as their output, and that is a bus that is being routed to the stereo output right here. In the case of Logic, this is not shown by a bus or by an input, rather it's just shown by this stereo logo right here. So to recap, a bus in audio engineering is a signal path used to take one signal or multiple signals and route them to another place within the mixer or the digital audio workstation. All right, now let's move on to subgroups. A subgroup is a mixer channel fed by a group of tracks or channels combined onto a single bus. Similar tracks are often grouped together, such as the drums, which we already discussed here. We can also use background vocals going to their own subgroup, all the guitars going to their own subgroup, or any combination of tracks being sent to a subgroup. We can even have a case where we are just sending one channel to its own subgroup. In this case, just to keep things organized in my own brain, I did this for the keys. However, if we're working in smaller sessions, this may add more unnecessary routing than we would want in a session. I'll come back to this in a moment. A subgroup offers control over the entirety of the grouped sources, often with its own inserts, sends, pan pots, faders, and output routing. So if we go back here to the drums, this is where we have the most channels being bussed together to a subgroup. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 channels of audio being bussed together into this drum subgroup. I could actually go down here and label this for semantics as the drum subgroup rather than the drum bus. However, as I mentioned previously, this is more so just about semantics, so we don't have to label this any particular way. So again, all of these drum tracks are being bussed together into this drum subgroup, and then all being affected by these inserts right here, including the SSL compressor. I have a clipper right here and a limiter right here as well. These tracks are being affected by these inserts. We'll talk about inserts momentarily, and they are all being processed together by this compressor, clipper, and limiter on the drum subgroup. From there, the drum subgroup is being bussed to the stereo output of the digital audio workstation. So if we move throughout the rest of the session, we see here that we have 2 bass tracks being bussed on bus 2. This is coming into the bass bus input, and the bass bus is really the bass subgroup. So I won't go through and relabel all of these, but I'll just move through the rest of the session so that we can get a better idea of what these subgroups are. In this case, the bass subgroup is being affected by this Pro Q3, which is giving us a dynamic boost of about 7 dB at about 1650 hertz. So each bass track right here is being affected by its own inserts, and then both of these tracks are being affected by the Pro Q3 right here on the bass subgroup. Again, this bass subgroup is being routed to the stereo output bus, which goes to the output of Logic Pro. Same thing with the guitars here. They're being bused to bus 3. Bus 3 is the input of the guitar bus, and the guitar bus is being affected just by this simple EQ. We're taking away about 3 dB at 256 hertz. The sax solo, 2 trombone tracks, trumpet, and the horn track right here, which is picking up each of these at the same time, are all being routed to bus 4. Bus 4 comes in on the horn subgroup right here, which I called the horn bus. And in addition to whatever they're being affected with here, they are also being affected by a channel EQ, a bit of saturation, and a bit of compression so that the vocals can duck all of the horns out when both are present. The keys track is being outputted to bus 5. Bus 5 is the input of this keys subgroup. Now, in this case, this is just for me and keeping things organized and everything kind of the same. If I wanted to mult this keys track and have 2 tracks for different processing, I would have them both still coming in on this keys bus. Really, this is just creating another channel in my session that is really unnecessary, but just to keep things organized in my own session, I prefer to do things this way, but you absolutely do not need to do this. There's no need for adding another subgroup, especially when there's no processing going on here and there's no multiple tracks going into that subgroup. But just for organizational purposes, I kept it like this on mine. On the vocals, we have the lead vocal and 2 background vocals. We see that these 3 tracks are being bused to bus 6, and then bus 6 is coming in on the vocal subgroup right here. In this case, there are no inserts on this vocal bus, but I still do have fader control and panning control that I can use to affect all of these tracks through this subgroup. So in this session, we have a vocal subgroup, a keys subgroup, even though we don't really need it, a horn subgroup, guitar subgroup, a bass subgroup, and a drum subgroup. So that makes up 6. And again, I can have inserts here that affect the audio of all of the tracks being summed into it at the subgroup. These inserts, of course, do not affect the individual channels and the audio coming out of them. Rather, it affects the audio once it passes through the subgroup. And we also get control over the panning and the fader control of the subgroups so that we can control the panning and the volume of this audio once it comes into the subgroup. So for example, if I was to play this, I could pan all the drums to the left. So bright, why can't you see me light? And I could also turn the drums all the way down if I wanted to. You saw it. And you also saw right there that there was some volume automation going on the drum subgroup. So I can automate the overall level of the drums throughout the song with this one fader rather than having to automate the faders of each of these individual tracks to get the same effect. So let's turn this panning back to center and let's move on to auxiliary tracks. An auxiliary track or aux track is a track or channel with a specified bus input that takes in audio from other channels or from external sources. Multiple tracks can have their signals routed to an aux track via pre or post fader sends or via their outputs, which we'll get to in a second. Each aux track, of course, can then be routed elsewhere. So in Logic Pro, each of our subgroups we have here are actually on auxiliary tracks. However, we tend to designate them differently just based on their purpose. So typically an aux track is going to be used for sends and returns. So an aux send is a bus path that can send audio from a channel independently from that channel's output. So in the case of the sax that we have right here, we have the output of the saxophone being routed to bus 4, which of course is our horn subgroup over here. But then we also have these 3 sends that we're using. So before the audio is being outputted to bus 4, the audio is also being sent to bus 13, bus 14, and this is muted at this part of the song, but eventually in the song it will be bussed to bus 23 as well. These sends can be either pre or post fader. If we were to click on it, we have, in the case of Logic, also post pan, but typically we will have post or pre fader. And if we were to go pre fader right here, then this send volume right here would be completely independent of what this volume output fader is doing on this particular sax channel. However, if we have post fader or post pan, then the amount of audio that is being sent to bus 13 will be dependent on this volume fader right here. So as an example, if we were to solo this saxophone right here, and let's go over here to bus 13, which is the stereo delay. We'll create a track so that we bring it right next to the sax. And we just played a part where the saxophone is present, like right here. We'll loop the chorus. And we'll listen and we'll see that this is post fader, in this case post pan as well. And I should mention that post pan means that moving this panning information will alter the panning of this send right here, if post pan is selected, which in this case it is. So let's play this back and hear how the send from this saxophone affects this effects return of the stereo delay. And we'll toggle between pre and post fader and mess around with the fader and the amount of send right here. So here we go. We see that the saxophone is playing and it's sending to bus 13 right here. We're getting some stereo delay along with the saxophone. We also see the saxophone coming out this horn bus right here, horn subgroup. Now, if we turn up the send right here, we get more stereo delay. And if we turn up the sax, because this is post pan, post fader, we also get more stereo delay. If we were to pan this all the way to the left, we'll see that because it's post pan, we're only getting stereo delay on the left. Same thing if we go to the right, we see that we're only getting information on the right. Now, if we were to turn this down, see that because we are post pan, post fader, we're not getting anything sent anymore to the stereo delay. However, if we were to switch this to pre fader, see that even though this is turned all the way down, this fader, we're still getting information sent to the stereo delay effects return, because this send is happening independently of whatever this fader is doing. So whether we crank it or pull it all the way down, we're still getting the same amount of stereo delay. So let's bring that back to what it was at and turn back on bus 14 here. And let's have a look at what's going on elsewhere in the session. So these vocals, for example, the lead vocal is being sent to that same stereo delay right here. But it's also being sent to bus 14, which is the mono delay right here, to bus 20, which is the vocal reverb effects return. And it's also being sent periodically to the vocal delay throw. At this moment in the mix, this is automated to be muted, but we have bus 25 over here, which is a vocal throw, which has a echo and some saturation and some gain applied to it. And we could go on throughout this session. You see that the background vocal 1 is being sent to the same 3 right here, 13, 14, 20. Also being sent to 19, which is a plate reverb, just to kind of push it a bit further back in the mix relative to the lead vocal. And it's also being sent to bus 21, which is another reverb effects return. So we have our effects sends right here, which can be post fader or pre-fader. In this case, all of my sends in this mix are being sent post fader. So whatever I move this fader to will have an effect over how much is being sent. Some of these sends are at unity, being sent at 0. You can see some of them are not being sent at all. Others are being sent at, in this case, negative 13 dB. So you have pot control right here over how much audio is being sent. So we can crank that or bring it back. So it's not only dependent on the fader itself. We also have independent control over the send right here. And the other end of the send, which is the auxiliary track that is being sent to, is typically referred to as an effects return or an auxiliary return. So in this case of the stereo delay, we have just Logic's stereo delay stock plugin, and then we have an EQ, which is not being used at this moment in time in the mix. And the terms send and return come from old hardware mixers where we would send audio out of a channel into a hardware effects unit, and then that unit would be returned back into the mixer. So in this case, we have, again, with the saxophone being sent post fader into bus 13, and then this is the effects return, which has the input of bus 13, and then is being returned to the stereo output of the mixer or the digital audio workstation in this case. So effects returns are very useful for time-based effects. You can see here that they're mostly delays and reverbs. So we have snare plate reverb, we've got a mono delay, we've got a guitar verb left, guitar verb right, an extra delay, an extra delay that's not being actually used in this particular mix, long plate reverb, vocal reverb, another reverb. But we also can use it for parallel processing, such as parallel compression, parallel saturation, and the like. In this case, we have drum parallel compression, and we've got parallel compression on the funk guitar as well. So in the case of the drum parallel compression, we've got SSL compressor right here, set to really compress the signal heavily. And we've also got the decapitator and some EQ, which is not currently present in the mix. And so if we scroll back to our drums over here, we see that the kick sample, kick out, snare top, snare sample, snare bottom, tom 1, tom 2, and a bit of the room are all being routed to bus 11. They're being sent to bus 11. So this is an auxiliary send right here. And the drum parallel compression, this is an effects return or a parallel channel, which has bus 11 as the input. And then it has these inserts that are heavily compressing the signal. Then I can bring that back up. So if I was to go over here and solo these drum tracks and then play them back, I have the drum parallel compression right here, which I can drive up. You can see that it's really getting slammed. Or I can bring it all the way down. And this parallel compression just helps add a little bit of punch and weight to the drums in the overall mix. So whether it's parallel processing like parallel compression, parallel saturation, or it's using other effects, notably delay and reverb time-based effects to add space to the mix, auxiliary sends and returns are invaluable routing tools for the mix. I actually have videos dedicated to parallel compression and parallel saturation. I'll leave links to those down in the description box below. Also, if you're finding this video helpful and useful thus far, please consider hitting that like button. It really helps out the channel here on YouTube. So I believe that covers effects, sends, and returns and auxiliary channels. that pretty much covers the main topics of routing, but I also wanted to discuss inserts, VCAs, and groups in the context of digital audio workstations. So an insert in audio engineering, in mixers, in digital audio workstations, is a patch point after the input or the preamp of a channel that allows us to insert a line level device like a hardware effects unit or a processor or plugin that is made up of both an output from the channel and an input back into the channel. So if we take the drum parallel compression effects return channel right here as an example again, we have 3 inserts on this channel. We've got the SSL compressor, the decapitator, and the channel EQ. And we can imagine the bus 11 being the input of this channel, which it is. Again, this is being fed by these sends over here from the drums, the kick, snare, toms, and a bit of the room. And so we have this as the input. So audio comes in the input, and then as it's coming down the channel, it comes out virtually, of course, in the case of a digital audio workstation. It comes out of the channel into this SSL compressor, and then it comes out of this SSL compressor back into the channel, moves on to the decapitator, comes out of the channel, into the decapitator, comes out of the decapitator back into the channel, from the channel into the channel EQ, out of the channel EQ, back into the channel. And then it moves on to, in this case, there are no sends, so it just moves on to the stereo output, which is the bus that it is being outputted to. So in this case, our inserts act to compress the channel, and then we're adding more compression and distortion to the channel here. And then we're adding EQ, although in this part of the song, there's no actual EQ being added. The curve here is flat. But these are what are known as inserts. And if we're thinking of these inserts in terms of routing, then we should be thinking of them as if they are hardware devices where audio is coming out of the channel through the plugin, out of the plugin back into the channel, and then so on and so forth. So in the case of this background vocal, for example, we have audio coming not from an input necessarily, but coming from the actual audio in the timeline here, right here. So audio is coming from here, and then it's going out of the channel into a gain plugin, back into the channel, out of the channel into a SSL channel, so on and so forth through the CLA 76. These two are bypassed, so we can imagine that audio is not flowing through them, and rather moving on to the de-esser, then the sibilance plugin, the limiter, and finally the doubler. And after that, the audio is being sent to bus 13, bus 14, bus 20, bus 19, and bus 21. These are all happening post-fader, so the fader has something to say about the overall level being sent there. We can see that there are different amounts of audio being sent to each of these sends. And finally, we are being outputted from background vocal 1 to bus 6. Bus 6 comes into the vocal subgroup and is finally being routed to the stereo output bus. So I hope that that makes sense from a routing standpoint. We're kind of bringing everything together now and looking at routing more holistically. Next on the list is the VCA. So VCA stands for voltage controlled amplifier, and it's a voltage controlled source, either physical or virtual in the case of digital audio workstations, that acts as a master control over the volume levels of the channels in the VCA group. So VCAs do not pass audio, but they help control audio as a fader that is separate from the individual tracks. So in the case of Logic, and this session in particular, we can have a look at our different VCAs. So in the mixer right here, we have a whole bunch of stuff going on. And if we scroll down here, we see VCA. So these 3 kick drums right here, these 3 snare drums, and these horns over here are all being sent to their own VCAs. And we see right here that we have our kick VCA right here. So this fader right here controls the level of each of these channels without us having to move around these faders whatsoever. So we'll bring these back, and this helps maintain the balance between these layered kicks or between these layered snares, or helps keep the balance between these different horn channels with one fader. So it's similar to a subgroup where we have all of these being routed to a subgroup. However, there's no audio passing through the VCA. It's simply a fader control, and that's all it does. You can see here that there's no input, there's no slots for inserts. We can't send audio because there is no audio on this VCA. So if we were to play back part of the chorus with everything, I'll move the VCA of the horns to show you how the VCA works over the volume of the horns right here.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground?
So just by moving the VCA, I got rid of all the horns. I can also make them louder than Unity if I wanted to.
You're lying inside of me, feel so bright. Why can't you see me like you saw?
So I can control the volume of all of these horns before they go out to bus 4 and into the horns subgroup right here, just by using this simple VCA right here. And this is particularly useful because I don't have to go through and individually automate or move these faders of each of the horn tracks. I can just do it all simply right here. If we go over here to the snare, for example, and open up our automation, you can see that I turned it off for the purposes of this video, but if I turn it back on, you can see that I'm automating the levels of the snares all together, and that way I don't really have to alter any volume on the snares themselves, although I am automating the snare top up here just to alter the balance or the sound of the snare toward the end of the song. But the micro shifts in the volume of the snares, let's say there's a snare fill that I want to accentuate, I can simply use a VCA to bring up the level without altering the balance of these 3 snare channels, and do it simply with just one VCA fader. Finally, let's talk about the term groups. Now, the term group in analog or hardware systems is often in reference to a subgroup. They typically mean the same thing. However, in digital systems and digital audio workstations, the term group often means something different. So in the case of this mix, I did a little bit of editing to the drums, and so I wanted to create a drum group. So we can see here, there's only one group in this particular session, the drums group, and we'll have a look at what that is here. So if I open up this section of Logic Pro, I can turn the group on. So now that we have the group on, we have these settings right here. And so grouping all of these tracks together is like linking them for editing purposes, for automation purposes, and what have you. So right here we have in these settings, editing, track alternatives, automation mode, volume, mute, input, sends, pan, solo, record, color, track zoom, and track hide. And so if, for example, I wanted to group these tracks together and control their volume, I could do so. This is engaged in volume. So if I was to move the volume of one of these tracks, it would move the volume of the rest of them. Now, groups can be equally as effective as VCAs in this case. However, VCAs are just a little bit cleaner, especially when it comes to automating, where you can just move one fader rather than controlling all of these at the same time, even though it's ultimately doing the same thing. But we can have full control over the volume right here. We also have control right now over the mute. So if I was to mute, let's say the Tom 1, you'll see that everything that is in this drums group is now muted. If I unmute, say the room 1, again, it's the same thing because everything is linked right now. We can do it for the input if we are recording. This is a super useful feature for tracking. I can engage panning, and now if I pan 1, it has the same relative effect over everything else in the group. Bring that back to 0. Solo, if I wanted to solo anything, it would solo everything else. Record, again, if we're tracking, we can set that up so that if I hit record on 1, of course, there are no input sources because this is a mixing session, but if I wanted to arm everything at once, this is a useful feature. And then we also have sends up to send 8 that we can look at grouping in this group. So let's say we go send 5. So that is grouped now. Now we have send 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say I wanted to send this to the long plate for whatever reason. I could go there. And although it's not going to set up these for me, I could have it so that changing the volume of the send right here will change it with all of the others. So I could go to the kick sample in this case, and adjusting the send volume right there will adjust it in every other channel within the group that has that send activated. So let's delete these now. And of course, if there was editing to be done, we could go in here now that editing is selected, and I could just click on one and it will highlight everything. If I wanted to cut and move, I only have to click on one and it keeps everything together as such. So super useful for tracking, for editing, and also has its use in mixing as well. So that is groups in digital systems. In Logic Pro, that's how you set those up as well. So not really having to do with routing per se, although it is useful to understand the differences between groups and subgroups and how they relate to digital systems as such. All right, so that covers the basics of routing inside mixers and digital audio workstations. If you found any of the definitions a bit unclear or would like better explanations, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, or to check out the article at My New Microphone on this subject that goes into a bit more detail. I'll leave that in the description box down below. If you found this video helpful, feel free to hit that like button. And if you'd like more content from My New Microphone, feel free to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell as well down below. And before I let you go, I will also put another few videos from the My New Microphone YouTube channel up in the top left and right corner. One has to do with the importance or the reason why we should be using busing in our mixes, and the other has to do with the importance and the why behind using effects, sends, and returns in our mixes. So if you'd like more information on these routing options and their utility in the mix, click on, again, one of these two videos up top, and I will see you in the next one.